Well, we're back with Strategic Advice. I'm Phil Haun, the host, and joining me today is Amanda Rosen. Amanda Rosen is a colleague of mine at the Naval War College, and she runs the Writing and Teaching Excellence Center there. She's a real expert on today's topic, which is active learning. And just a reminder, this is season 2 of Strategic Advice, and the focus is congratulations, brand new PhD. You've finally gotten that tenured track job. And now you have to get ready to teach those courses you've been yearning your whole life to teach. And we're here to provide some advice on what to be thinking about as you put forward, get ready for that first day of class. And today, the topic I think is particularly important based upon a lot of the research, and Amanda has published on this. I'll ask her to talk a little bit about her new book here. But the topic today is on active learning. I will say the disclaimer that the views expressed are our own and not of our institutions. Amanda, welcome to Strategic Advice.
Thanks, Phil. Good to be here.
Oh, great. Well, let's just go ahead and dive in on this topic on active learning. The floor is yours.
Great. So you're a new PhD, you're going into the classroom, and one of the most common things that I hear from people in that situation is their worry about teaching. And they say, I have all this, I'm teaching in this new course, maybe it's a survey course, it might not be really central to my dissertation, and I need to, put together 15 weeks of sessions on this. And how do I go about doing that? And the problem is that for most students, their instinct is to do something we call be a sage on the stage. The sage on the stage, the knowledgeable expert who transmits their knowledge to an eager, hopefully eager crop of students there to learn everything they have to offer. The problem is that the sage on the stage model is not very effective for learning. There is so much research that shows that this kind of passive approach of a knowledgeable subject matter expert talking about their field, in the moment, it can be great. If you're a good storyteller, it can be really engaging. But if you come back a few weeks later, it can be really hard for the listeners to really report back what they actually learned from it or demonstrate what they learned from it. There are exceptions, of course. We all know great lecturers. I work with many of them. So it's not that you can't give good lectures, but what I would encourage you to do from very early on in your career is to, instead of being a sage on the stage, to think about how you can be a guide on the side. And I wish I made up these acronyms, these things, but I didn't. And the guide on the side approaches learning in a different manner. Instead of it being about my knowledge transmitted to the people in the audience, instead, it's about my ability to help each and every one of those audience members, those students, to gain the knowledge, develop the skills, and consider the values that the course is designed to teach. And that's where active learning comes in, right? Active learning often gets contrasted with passive learning, but really what it means is having students do things and think about what they're having them do. So in a lecture, you can still do this, and a lecture can be interactive. And I really encourage you, if you're going to seek out one book as a new PhD entering the classroom, it's Elizabeth Barkley and Claire Major's book, Interactive Learning. This is a fantastic book. I have it on my shelf, and it is all about how you take a lecture and make it more interactive so that you transform what is often a passive approach to learning into an active one. And there's lots of techniques you can do to do this that don't actually take a lot of time. So for example, you can tell a compelling story and then ask students how that story applies to the concepts that they read about for that week. Now, you as the professor, of course, could just do that. You could tell the story and then explain how it connects. But if you stop and say, all right, I want everyone to take a minute and go back to your notes that you just did about the reading. And I want you to now think about how would you connect these two pieces? That simple process of asking students to engage in the material is going to help them remember it more and learn it better and be able to apply it in the future. You're actually asking them to then do a skill of connecting two pieces of information. And then that is a skill, hopefully, because that's part of critical thinking, something you might want to develop later on. Another technique is something called a think, pair, share. So you pose a question, and then you ask students to take a minute and just jot down their initial answers to that question, and then turn to a neighbor and share their answers, and then bring everyone back to the final group and ask some pairs to share. You can do this in a 500-person lecture. There's nothing stopping you. And sure, you're not going to have every student report back on what they learned, but that's not the point. The point is that they've engaged in this active process of thinking about what they're listening to, then talking to another student, getting some instant feedback on whether their ideas gel with what their classmates had to say. And then you share a few examples, and maybe you can get a sense of what the larger group has to think. Sometimes even a strategic pause or asking students to make a prediction about what they think will come next. All of these are very easily adopted techniques, many of them outlined in the interactive lecturing book, that will help transform what is a sage on the stage style of teaching into something more active and more likely to result in learning. The last sort of lecture tip I want to share is to do learning checks. So these are just checks midway through a lecture or at the end of a lecture, at the end of a section, to see what students have learned and where their learning is at. There's a lot of ways to do this. You can do something called the muddiest point. So you can ask students to, you can hand out index cards, or you can create a Google form, whatever, digital or non-digital format you like. And you say, what was the muddiest point of this lecture? What's the thing you didn't get? And if it's on an index card or a Google form, you actually have them hand that into you on the way out of class. And then you can quickly thumb through those and see what are the most common muddiest points. And then when you come back to class next time, you can start with that and say, here's a point I wasn't clear on. It's a way for you to get instant feedback and to make sure that the things that you think are really important in that lecture, that the students are able to identify those and learn them. If you don't want to do the muddiest point, you can actually use a polling software like Poll Everywhere, where the students, as long as they have a device, and of course you can provide an index card to any student that does not have a device, you could put a multiple choice question up on the board, and students with their devices can instantly respond, and you can see how many students got it correct and how many didn't. Eric Mazer at Harvard, and he's in the physics department, developed a process called peer instruction, where he uses a technique that kind of involves some interactive learning, where the students actually teach each other some of the material and help each other. So there's a lot of ways that you can take big lecture environments and still make them interactive and active and actually make sure that students are learning, because talking about things doesn't actually mean learning. And now I'm wondering, of course, that if I quiz all of the listeners of this podcast, if I quiz them all in 3 weeks, are they going to remember anything that I said? Probably not, because it's not super interactive. But that's okay. Beyond lectures, there are lots of other ways to do active learning. Discussion is the one that would come most readily to anyone else. But even discussion is only active if all the students are engaged in it. And I think the problem with discussion is that sometimes a few students dominate it and the rest check out. So for the students that are dominating it, they may be active in the lecture, but are they actively learning, or are they just talking? And the students who feel like their voices aren't valued, they've probably completely checked out and aren't learning either. So thinking about how you lead discussions, how you pull students towards the takeaways from that discussion, or encourage them to take notes on that discussion, how you provide opportunities for everyone to not only talk, but to actively listen. There are ways to make discussion an opportunity for active learning as well. And then, of course, there's the kind of, when people say active learning, particularly to me, because I work in the simulations and game space, everyone's thinking about games and simulations. Phil, I know that you do too. And simulations, games, exercises, all of those can be active learning when done well. But I've also seen games where students aren't engaged. And so for them, it's not an active learning experience. But if you want to try simulations and games, they run the gamut from 10, 20-minute exercises to full course simulations. And there's a lot that's been published in that space in national security, political science, history, et cetera. So there's a wealth out there. But what I would say is about active learning is that active learning doesn't require that you commit to playing diplomacy in your class or some other big simulation. It can be as simple as asking a question in a lecture and provoking genuine thought. And that means that all of us, no matter how new you are to the discipline of teaching, all of us are capable of actively engaging our students and helping them learn. You just kind of have to put in a little bit of extra work. And remember, it's not always about what you know and what you don't know. It's about what your students are able to learn.
All right. Well, that's fantastic. Of course, I'm really into active learning. As a matter of fact, these podcasts are my way of the course that I teach of trying to get some of the knowledge outside the class so that the students can watch these videos before class. Some of the coursework I put out so that we can engage in active learning in the classroom. So can you, with the time we have available, you tell me, I'm fascinated about your new book. Because I know it has to do with active learning. I know some of the listeners would be interested in it as well.
Sure. So my book is called Teaching Political Science, and it's coming out with Paul Grave McMillian later this year. And it's just that. It's about how do you go about, you're a new instructor, how do you go about teaching political science? It's the application of all of the scholarship of teaching and learning to our discipline. So it starts out with a teaching philosophy that I welcome everyone to borrow and develop and adapt until you have your own, that is represented by the acronym FATE. So the premise of FATE is that a lot of us think that good teachers are born, not made. And when we think of the amazing teachers we've had in our lives, that those teachers, they just fell out of, came out of Zeus's skull to be the most amazing teacher like Athena. When actually it's a practice and a discipline. So FATE is the name of the acronym, and it stands for flexibility, active engagement, transparency, and empathy. And those are the values that inform all of the decisions I make when it comes to teaching. And then the rest of the book applies that and some tips on how to be an efficient teacher to things like how to design courses, how to create assignments, grading and feedback. What are the different teaching techniques? How do you develop a lecture? How do you deal with technology and other teaching challenges? But it's really aimed at helping that new instructor how to learn all the things about teaching that your graduate program probably didn't get a chance to teach you.
Well, great. Well, I also wanted to interview Amanda because I think some of the grad students, particularly at top universities, and I know you went to the Ohio State, so you went to a top program, believe that professors are only primarily there for research and they have to teach. But you have an excellent example in the fact that actually in our profession, the core of what we do is teaching, whether that be through our writing or in our classroom. And that graduate students, you can have a very fulfilling career focusing, and actually your research began to focus on teaching as a practitioner. And you've been a great example to me. I've published a couple of pieces based upon my teaching, based upon your mentorship. And I just want to encourage, you're a brand new professor out there. I know that you're supposed to teach courses and you're supposed to write to make tenure, but remember the trajectory is decades long and you want to be good at your profession. And taking on some of these things like active learning seriously early on can help you to craft really good courses that really don't take an extraordinary amount of extra effort to do. So Amanda, thank you so much for joining me today on Strategic Advice.
Thanks, Phil.